Hi and welcome to our webinar on the Great Health Regeneration. So we're the Alliance for Natural Health International. I'm Melanie Aldridge, the Executive Coordinator, and I'm a practitioner. And shortly I'm going to be handing over to Dr. Robert Verkerk, who is a PhD scientist, who's the founder and executive and scientific director of our organization. If you've been following our work for the last 18 months or so, you'll know that we're very focused on what we call our blueprint for health system sustainability. It's a world first. It's the first time that sustainability principles have been linked to health and brought together. So you see sustainability talked about all the time in terms of tourism and environment and travel and fuel, but you don't often see it talked about in terms of health. But you only have to look around the world to see that health systems are literally buckling under the pressure of chronic disease and people's ill health. And yet these miraculous machines that we're in, these sensitive, multidimensional, diverse bodies that we inhabit are our entire ecological system unto themselves. And you take our ecological system and you put it into the middle of your communities and your country and your town and your environment, and you realize that the complex interactions that are moving on and moving within us all really is like an ecosystem like you'd find in the rainforest. And so our sustainable health system is all based on principles of ecology and health and sustainability. And yet we've had so many people say to us, but what does that mean for me? And today's webinar is all about what that means for you. And we've called it the Great Health Regeneration, because really it's about looking at how you can take your ecology and bring that together with sustainability principles and increase the health for you, for everyone around you, and in the same time for the planet as well. So it's about DIY health, it's about self-care, it's about health empowerment, getting into the driver's seat of your own health and being able to actually determine how your health course in life is going to run. So without further ado, for the next hour or so, I'm about to hand over now to Dr. Robert Verkerk. So welcome, Rob. And anyone who's got any questions, please just drop them in, and I will make sure that those questions are all asked in the Q&A for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So enjoy.
Thank you, Mel. It's a really interesting fact, but there are many people outside of the medical profession who are really learning about how to look after themselves. And these are health optimizers, these are biohackers, but there are also people from traditional systems of medicine who have really seen the human body as a whole system interacting not only with an internal system, all the microorganisms, for example, in our gut, but also with the outside world. And that really is a necessity now if we're going to be dealing with some of the major crises that we face. We definitely face a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. If we face a crisis in the environment, it's no great surprise that we also face a crisis in terms of human health. And in looking for solutions, it does go well beyond just taking certain things out of the diet. And I'm, of course, referring to the understanding that eating a little less red meat may have important environmental benefits. What we're doing here is saying, right, how does a healthcare system, a system that manages our health, look when you start applying these principles? And really one of the first things to appreciate is that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. And if we don't do something fairly quickly, we will have a crisis of extraordinary magnitude on our hands, particularly for the young people of today. In the UK alone, for example, we face in the next 6 years a £50 billion hole, black hole, in terms of adult social care. And because we have people living a little bit longer, and we've got people with a very high level of chronic preventable disease, this amounts to an extraordinary problem, and there just isn't the capacity to be able to deal with these people. So self-care becomes a really, really important part of it. And self-care is a whole lot more than just taking medications at particular times. Self-care really is about trying to optimize health, and using nature, which we are part of, to be able to do that as efficiently as possible. So take a disease like breast cancer. It's the single most common disease in women. Historically, we have used broad spectrum chemotherapy to deal with it, compounds like methotrexate. We discovered back in 2004, thanks to the paper by Morgan et al., looking at both US and Australian data, that showed that this main approach, really important approach to breast cancer, was yielding surprisingly low effectiveness. And in fact, if you look at 5-year survival, it was less than 5%. So bottom line is that we started looking at more specifically targeted chemotherapy agents, particularly single target chemotherapy agents, such as monoclonal antibodies and tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And what did that do? That created the possibility of resistance. So we started to see more and more chemotherapy resistance, and now we've opened the door to multi-target tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And this is really part of a treadmill that we've seen in other areas, such as agriculture, where you see this transition from broad spectrum pesticides to narrow spectrum ones. Then insects and pathogens start developing resistance. You need to use more of them, and you're all the time seeking a new technological solution. What this does is drive up the costs of healthcare, because you are deviating from natural systems. You increase the amount of side effects, and the reality is that you don't get high levels of effectiveness in all people. Only a limited number of people benefit. So this is not really a sustainable approach to healthcare. Now, one of the reasons we are so focused on looking at these chemotherapeutic strategies is really thanks to a Frenchman and a German going back to the 19th century. So Louis Pasteur developed the germ theory of disease, where he really argued that each disease has a single cause that's linked to a particular germ, a particular pathogen. And 30 years later, Robert Koch came along and said, you know, to verify disease, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can take that disease organism, put it into a petri dish, develop it, and put it back into an organism and show that the disease occurs. Those were the Koch postulates. And of course, it's no surprise then that France and Germany became the center for the development of the pharmaceutical industry that has really been going strong, particularly for 60, 70 years now. And the drug pipeline is getting ever more empty. There are specific developments in the area of biologics, where you're taking principles that have biological origins, but using them in a manner that is really new to nature. So the potential for side effects is very high indeed. So we now are in a position where we really do understand that most diseases have multiple causes. And in fact, if you look particularly at the chronic preventable diseases that create primary burdens on healthcare systems, they have many, many causes indeed. And in fact, they are the results of behaviors, lifestyles, diets that have contributed to them over often decades. And we get a situation where people live potentially for decades in a subclinical disease phase, which is often not looked for or diagnosed by a health professional or a doctor. But then when the car breaks down on the side of the road and disease has developed, we've hit that point of pathogenesis and we see symptoms of the disease. You roll up to your doctor, and treatment begins. And of course, we see this massive downstream manifestation. There are some 30,000 or so diseases that have been identified, and we live much of our latter part of our lives in this phase of morbidity and comorbidity. And when we're in that phase, we have less biological potential. We've got reduced health and resilience. We are on multiple drugs. And frankly, the system is breaking under that kind of pressure. It's no way to live. So when you look at what is required for a transition to a regenerative health system, we've got to see things in a different way. We cannot leave healthcare late in the life cycle, because we get a very high level of comorbidities, and also the longer you leave it, the more difficult it is to reverse those diseases. Obviously, from a societal point of view, the costs go up, and we start to see significant losses in terms of productivity, and economies start falling apart. So the existing system is this reactive system. We need to move towards a proactive system where healthcare doesn't just occur in clinics and hospitals, it occurs in the workplace, it occurs at home, in the kitchen, in school playgrounds and school lunch halls. It's got to occur in life, because that it is the behaviors during our lives that actually contribute to this disease. Now, in the simplest possible way, we can say we just need to change 7 things. Very, very straightforward. And let's just look at these fundamental levers for change. We need to move away from a focus on disease to actually what we need to do to create positive health, resilience, and well-being. We also need, if an individual is to be in the driving seat of their own health, to a situation where doctors don't own your health, you own your health. You also own your data associated with your health. So you're in an empowered position. We need to move to a situation where the language that is used by health professionals and around health professionals and between ourselves in communities doesn't alienate the public. So we have to share a common language. So within our blueprint is really a whole new way of referring to body systems and approaches and health systems, so that we can have a common language that health professionals, regardless of their modalities, can use a common language when they're talking to people. And this is also very important as we see the digitization of health systems and people using more and more apps and wearables and other devices to look at particular health barometers or markers. We need to move away from hospitals and clinics being the main place where we do healthcare to the community being the place that we do healthcare. Hospitals and clinics are where we go when the system breaks down, but that's about disease management, not disease care. And because if we're really to address the problem of preventable chronic diseases, that is the primary thing that is going wrong in our lives, we actually need to move away from this idea that we can just get a pill for an ill, drug-based interventions, and really understand the power of using personalized food, lifestyle, nutritional, botanical, non-drug interventions, body work, and the rest of it. We need to move away from just treating symptoms to finding natural balance. The human body is desperate to find equilibrium across multiple systems so it can self-heal. And good healthcare is about providing both that internal and external environment. And finally, the 7th lever is about moving away from this notion of individuals, patients, being passive recipients of healthcare to a situation where the individual is empowered and is largely engaged in self-care, and really uses health professionals as and when guidance is required on that self-care journey. The next thing we really need to do is alter how we look at health itself. And health is really primarily the state of being free from illness or injury. But resilience is potentially a much more useful concept. It is the ability to bounce back and adapt to any kind of stress, whether it's a physiological stress, an emotional stress, a chemical stress, an electromagnetic stress, any kind of stress, our ability to adapt to that. And a really resilient human being is one that can handle being in very diverse environments. They're not necessarily stress-free environments, but they're environments in which people can survive in a very high level of well-being or healthfulness. The other thing we need to do is understand that it is the function of different systems in our body that is key to our health. And we have to look at how these systems function in this complex, interacting ecological system in which we live. And it is often the way in which we respond to these interactions that defines our health. And of course, that is a feature of our genetic environment interactions. And one of the reasons we can so often find ourselves coming back to the importance of the diet is because the diet is probably the most intimate way in which we interact with our external environment. Some of you will have heard about the concept of the quantified self. It's really taking on shape as we see more and more apps and wearables and technologies that are measuring specific markers of health. And of course, we can only measure those things that are easier to measure. And as we look at the overall whole health system, we start to realize that actually there are many things that cannot be easily quantified. They can be qualified, but they are more subjective. So when we start looking at elements that affect our emotions that are really important to our health, these ideas are often have to be measured subjectively and not objectively. So, if we were to look at just one element, such as meaning or purpose in life, the satisfaction of higher needs, these really need to be looked at from a subjective point of view. So we really prefer to see this notion of developing an understanding not only of the quantified self, but also the qualified eco-self. And the reason why we use the term eco-self is because we're looking at the interaction between the individual and the ecological environment within which that individual lives. And it's really important we don't become isolated and, dare I say it, selfish in terms of the way in which we look at the human being. Let's take an example of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, both in the United States and in the UK, to take two examples, is set on a massively elevated trajectory in terms of incidence. And in fact, if we look at these kinds of incidences, just this one disease is set to really upset adult care systems. We do not have the space, the availability, and people don't have the money, or there is not sufficient money within the health system to be able to cope with the Alzheimer's burden. So Dale Bredesen from UCLA and more recently at the Cleveland Clinic in the US has developed a therapeutic system that gives us a window into the kinds of approaches that we need to be thinking about. And these are multi-therapeutic approaches. So his system uses over 25 different protocols that are developed depending on the specific condition of that individual. So it's also a personalized system. And we need to begin to realize that if we are to address these systems, we need to be integrating these kind of protocols into our daily lives. And in many respects, when you look at the therapeutic system that Bredesen has developed through the Bredesen protocol, you'll see that they are key elements of anyone's healthy lifestyle. And so there is a need for a major re-education in terms of how we go about doing healthcare. And this really has led us to how we can have a system that is sustainable. And of course, when most people think about a health system, they think of hospitals and clinics. In reality, the health system relates to all aspects of the control of health that an individual or a community has. And so actually the key unit in the health system is the individual and the community itself. The hospitals and clinics, if you like, are just structures in a system that we've got used to being the primary provider of goods and services. And of course, when we start looking at preventable chronic diseases, we really learn that this system is not going to deliver the goods that we need, particularly not in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So we need fundamental changes. So we wrote our original blueprint looking at the UK system. And in essence, it is a universal approach. It's the use of a language for an upstream model. You'll remember upstream is all about how we can look at those things that influence health at a very early stage in someone's life. And that includes the whole body, multi-system assessment of health and resilience using an ecological framework. And another key part of the model is to ensure that the healthcare providers, what we call the health guides, are also part of the system. They have also agreed to certain standards for communication and methods for looking at the body so that they can all share a common language. In this journey, we really need fundamentally to turn the page from this disease management system where we focus on treating symptoms and move to this progressive health regeneration model, which is what the blueprint is about. At the core of our blueprint is what we call the ecological terrain. That is the environment within which an individual lives. And through a consensus approach over a couple of years, we have really come to an agreement that there are 12 domains of health that are absolutely fundamental to have in balance if you want to have a healthy, resilient individual that does not provide the kind of environment that allows diseases, in particular chronic diseases, to manifest. So I'm going to take you very quickly through these 12 domains. Firstly, we have to understand something of an individual's genetic and epigenetic background. So that means looking at their book of life and the way in which the environment has influenced the expression of those genes. And the reality is we can do that a whole lot easier now that genetic tests have come down massively in price. Really important to understand that one of the ways of personalizing or individualizing our approach to healthcare is really by understanding the strengths and weaknesses of someone's book of life. So that's step number one. Second area is looking at glycemic control and metabolic flexibility. Now this is, in simple terms, the ability of someone to manage their blood sugar levels. And the obesity and type 2 diabetes and even type 3 diabetes or Alzheimer's crisis that we see today is really a manifestation of this loss of ability among large sectors of the population to manage their blood sugar properly. And the concept of metabolic flexibility is really our ability to switch between different fuels and be able to go significant periods of time without living off easy to burn carbohydrate fuels. And this has really spawned an interest in things like intermittent fasting and caloric restriction, reducing the total amount of food, extending the time between eating intervals, and obviously driving also the low carb movement, which is how we manage to substitute other macronutrients, fats in particular, in place of carbohydrates, so that we're not driving ourselves down this carbohydrate only route. And one of the problems there is, if we do that, our fat burning machinery, our beta oxidation of fatty acids, is so crucial to developing really clean fuel, producing lots of ATP, the primary fuel that we use in our body, by burning of fats. That whole system becomes dormant and goes to sleep. Third area is looking at our GI, our gastrointestinal system, and our microbiome. As I said earlier, it is the most fundamental way in which we interact with the outside world. We have to take these nutrients that get their energy from sunlight, that then pick up minerals, manufacture other compounds, and we have to be able to assimilate these nutrients properly. And one of the reasons that the gut becomes such a central aspect to all the great traditional systems of medicine is because it has been understood over thousands of years that if you sort that out first, many other systems come into balance. And there is no doubt that in modern medicine, Western medicine, we have not spent anything like enough time. In fact, we routinely put children on courses of antibiotics that wipe out the microbiome, and we just assume it's going to come back into function. And of course, many mainstream doctors are only very recently learning about the fundamental function of the microbiome, not just for nutrient assimilation, but also the function of the immune system, the function of the brain through the vagal connection. So it's a really critical zone to sort out. Fourth zone is mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are the energy producing organelles in our bodies. They're like energy factories, and they have a very short life cycle. From an evolutionary point of view, they came into our bodies as bacteria and made their homes, much as the chloroplasts in plants became the powerhouses that photosynthesize and produce energy from sunlight. These have done it producing chemical energy, using various substrates. And at university, I learned that glucose was the only energy source for mitochondria. And it's only later that I discovered, well, actually, we can use proteins, we can burn muscle, and we do that when we're starving. But most importantly, the most efficient way of generating energy through mitochondria is actually to burn fat. And in addition to that, we can, particularly when we have reduced carbohydrate input over long periods, we can start to produce ketones from our liver that actually fuel the mitochondria and also produce large amounts of ATP. So again, we have to find ways of making mitochondria abundant. So we need to increase the density, but also the volume of these. And if you like, people who have strong muscles, which is where the particular tissues that we have most mitochondria, actually have more energy in the body. And as we get very old, if we don't build up our mitochondrial reserve, we become very frail. And if we become very frail, we simply don't have enough energy to run all the systems in our body. So it's really, really important to be thinking about how we can trigger mitochondrial biogenesis, produce more density and volume of our mitochondria. Fifth area is the immune system, which is our incredibly complex system that has an innate side and a cell-mediated side, adaptive side, that really controls how we respond to the outside environment. And of course, we're beginning to see some major dysfunction in the immune systems, which is not just the inability to mount an adequate immune response to treat a foreign body, a pathogen, a bacterial infection. We are seeing the rise of infectious diseases again, but we're also seeing some confusion within the immune system and this rapid development of autoimmune conditions where the body has trouble discerning between self and non-self. And again, when you look at the upstream causes of autoimmunity, you'll see that a large part of it is linked to modern lifestyles. We have lost our way in terms of our evolutionary adaptation as human beings. probably over 1 million years, where we've evolved in certain kinds of environments, living in specific ways, eating particular types of foods. And we've taken ourselves out of that in the last few seconds, if we are to look at our entire evolutionary lifespan as a 24-hour clock. So how do we maintain immune competence and resilience and get our system to be well modulated? The sixth area is oxidative stress. In short, that is where the balance between reducing and oxidizing agents goes out. The three areas that run together in terms of underpinning chronic disease are really oxidative stress, immune response, and inflammation, which is actually closely linked to both systems. So we need to be able to manage that. If you look at heart disease, for example, heart disease is driven not by cholesterol, not by LDL cholesterol or VLDL cholesterol, but by the oxidation of very low density lipoprotein particles that actually start forming atherosclerotic plaques. So really important to be thinking about how we can manage that. And that doesn't necessarily mean just pitching in vast amounts of antioxidants, because in fact we've seen that that can sometimes actually induce oxidation. But again, it's all about balance. The seventh system is really this super system, this integration between the neurological system and the endocrine system. It's an extremely sophisticated system that essentially is controlling our nerves on one side and our hormones on another. And it's extraordinarily complex. It is strongly linked to almost every function within the body. And as we live in stressful environments, many of you will be familiar with the fight and flight response, and also rest and digest processes that relate to the triggering of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic side of our autonomic nervous system. We don't sufficiently address, particularly in mainstream medicine, how we can get these systems into balance. And it's really about being in a perfect position where you can do both things and often cycle from being able to release plenty of adrenaline, do what you do, but be able to also move into the parasympathetic side. If you don't, you are unable to recover and you generally start suffering from diseases related to stress. The circulatory system, system number 8 or domain 8, relates both to our cardiovascular system and also our lymphatic system. Heart disease and stroke remain among the single biggest killers, particularly in Western societies. And of course, none of these systems exist on their own. They all interact with other systems. So we've talked about how inflammation and oxidative stress and immune responses can actually relate to heart disease. So that's how they come together. We also know that mitochondria and gut and glycemic control also affect how the cardiovascular system and circulatory system function. The next 4 areas we're going to look at are areas that don't get enough attention in mainstream medicine. They are looking at chemicals, our toxicity burden, our ability to transform them, looking at our musculoskeletal system and how to maintain that over a lifetime, psychological and cognitive function, where there's been far too much attention on the use of specific drugs, and really our need to satisfy higher needs, what we call psychosocial emotional health status. So very briefly, on the toxic burden and biotransformation, there are now over 100 million different distinct chemicals that have been described in the CAS registry. We are exposed to a massive number of these. Some estimates suggest that we're exposed to over 20,000 different chemicals a day. And when governments and agencies decide to assess them, they generally look at each chemical in isolation. So we have no real idea how people react to being exposed to mixtures, other than the fact that we see an increasing number of people who become sensitized, chemically sensitized to these environmental chemicals and benefit once you reduce exposure to them. We also understand a great deal about our detoxification or biotransformation processes, and there's an awful lot we can do to enhance those processes with specific foods and nutrients and herbs and other compounds. And again, this has been outside the scope of mainstream medicine. In terms of our structural integrity, really important, and this obviously ties in with our mitochondrial reserves and function, we need to maintain a strong structure on which to support the human body. And as individuals become older, we just see a rapid deterioration of their musculoskeletal structure, where there isn't sufficient focus in terms of maintaining lean muscle mass, and you know, obviously understanding the range of things that we need to do to maintain healthy bones as well. In terms of psychological and cognitive function, obviously this is the area of mental health, and we see mental health on its own almost having the capacity to collapse health systems as we know it. There's a huge amount that we can do there, and it's interesting that when we look at key solutions, people are often driven to looking still at a drug-based solution, when actually the problems in mental health seem, in particular, when we look upstream, to be related to conditions that develop through disconnection, social disconnection, nature disconnection. And of course, this is to a degree down to changes in the fabric of society that we need to address. But again, there's a huge amount that can be done to build more resilience psychologically, build psychological function, as well as cognitive function, particularly as people age. Final area I'm going to touch on is domain 12, psychosocial and emotional health status. Emotions are such important drivers of particularly our behavior, but also affect our attitude. And they really have this extraordinary ability to affect all parts of our physiology. And one of the things we increasingly understand that certain states like happiness, that actually require us to have many things that are aligned in our lives, need to come together for that to happen. And that happens best when we function in intact families and communities, because we are social animals. And of course, it is also really important to ensure that people are able to develop higher needs and act on those higher needs. And we have developed consumer-based societies that don't value these things sufficiently. So this isn't about necessarily how much money you've got in your bank account, but it is how rich you are in terms of what is going on inside, in your heart especially. So I want to now start looking at a breakdown of how you can look at these 12 domains as pillars, if you like, of health and resilience. What are the areas that we need to really start focusing on? And within the individual, we've broken it down into 4 main areas. These are really key areas that if people focus on them, both themselves and with input from their health guides, their health practitioners, they're able to often transform dramatically their level of health and resilience. And the first one relates to our ability to assimilate nutrients. And this also relates to the intake of a diverse range of nutrients. A lot of the diet that we consume today is very simplified. We have globalized our food supply. We produce a lot of the plants that we consume through hydroponic systems that are not growing in living soils. We've devastated the inner workings of our gut, and our microbiomes are often quite dysfunctional, and we're not able to extract what we should be extracting from the nutrient-dense foods that we should be consuming. Second area relates to stress. We all live in stressful environments. There's nothing wrong with a stressful environment. The problems develop depending on our response to that stress. And if we have a negative response to that stress, we have problems, regardless of what kind of stress it is, whether it's stress at work, stress at home, whether it's chemical stress, physiological stress. So an athlete needs to have a pretty healthy response to be able to recover from intense training sessions, just as someone who has a very stressful family life or work environment. The third area is movement. Incredibly important to think of what movement is about. Signing up for a gym membership is not what movement is about, because for many people, the neuroendocrine changes, the neurological and hormonal patterning that actually drives an interest in starting to move, and particularly get outside and engage in rhythmic activity that triggers endocannabinoids in our body and makes us want to do it, are out of balance. So we also see people who just don't have sufficient mitochondrial reserve to be able to do it. So looking at the multiple systems that relate to encouraging movement, which is absolutely seminal and we're talking about not occasional movement just on a Saturday afternoon, we're talking about daily, regular movement. We look at the blue zone, the 5 identified blue zone areas where we have centenarians living with very low levels of disease. We see that movement occurs on a regular basis for at least 10 hours of every day, and none of it involves going to gyms. And the fourth area is really looking at these higher needs, social needs, sexual needs, self-actualization needs, things that are often not on the list of things you talk about when you go and see your doctor, despite the fact that they may be the most important fundamental drivers of who we are, how we behave in our environments. Now, speaking of environment, let's now look at 4 pillars that we need to focus on within our environment. Obviously, air quality is really, really important. If you live in a city, it's a lot tougher, but using a lot of houseplants and living in areas or spending time in areas with lots of trees and other plants will actually reduce your exposure. Walking on the side of a pavement away from a busy road will reduce your exposure. So there are many things we can do to improve our air quality. Our water quality is really key. Water, even more so than food, is the single most important macronutrient we put into our bodies. And yet, when we live in big cities, we consume water that has been through an individual multiple times every day. And we're seeing an increased amount of certain compounds like xenoestrogens, for example, that are residues from contraceptive and HRT drugs that end up in the water supply that are not removed by municipal systems. So there are things that we can do to ensure that we have cleaner water that avoids exposure to these, and reverse osmosis systems are just one example of how we can remove those systems, those compounds from our water. And finally, we've got to look at the living and non-living aspects of our environment. And the living relates not just to the birds and the bees and the importance of being in nature. We've seen how important it is for people to spend time in nature. The great tradition of forest bathing in Japan stems exactly from that knowledge that's been known for thousands of years. And now we're starting to see it being applied specifically in healthcare in the West, where we see great benefits for people who spend time in a natural environment. But it also relates to understanding our relationship with microorganisms. So, for example, we need microorganisms. People who live in a very sterile environment and spend a lot of time sterilizing their domestic environments, particularly if they have children, will raise children that are less healthy than those that are exposed to a natural environment where they're exposed to microorganisms in their daily life. Playing in the soil, being exposed to bugs is actually a pretty healthy thing to build resilience in the immune system. And finally, our non-living environment goes way further than just the minerals, for example, that exist in the Earth's crust that are, you know, a significant part of what a healthy soil is all about. We've now got to be looking at the non-living aspects of environment that have profound impacts on our health, including the chemicals, synthetic as well as natural, and of course, other aspects such as new sources of radiation, particularly those caused by radio frequencies and milliwave frequencies, the development of 5G. These have potentially huge consequences in terms of changing natural environments, affecting not only sensitive organisms like pollinators and migratory birds, but also effects really on every single part of the living system, including humans themselves. So we need to be looking at ways in which we can really focus on all those 8 pillars in order to self-care properly. I'm now going to give you a quick insight to the workings of our blueprint model. And our blueprint model fundamentally is not about projecting on others what kind of healthcare should be provided. It's more about measuring what happens to people within this ecosystem that we all live in. And in order to measure what's going on, it's really important that everyone can get some measure. And this means it must be accessible to everyone. So we've developed 3 levels of assessment that relate to self, where someone can, at no specific cost, develop use approaches that often are surrogate measures, so they're not the direct measure themselves. They may often be qualitative rather than quantitative, but they're really easy to interpret. They're very easy to do. They don't involve tech. They might involve a tape measure. So an example, for example, would be using a tape measure to measure your waist to height ratio. And you know that if your height is less than half your waist, you are probably developing excess fat around your middle, central adiposity, that's strongly correlated with chronic diseases, particularly obesity and type 2 diabetes. You can also look out for things like, do you suffer from blood sugar crashes? If you go 3, 4, 5 hours without any food, are you desperate to try and put some simple carbohydrate into your system to feed your system? That's another indication that your blood sugar isn't well managed. So we have these self-care assessment methods for all 12 body systems that people can follow. We're looking at digitizing the whole system so that people can actually have a dashboard to see exactly where they are at any particular time. The second level is really an intermediate level where you can probably gather a lot of your data. You may need some technology. So for example, using a chest strap to measure your heart rate and then feed that to a digital device that measures heart rate variability, which is one of the most powerful measures of your parasympathetic sympathetic function, looking at your autonomic nervous system and your response to stress. Really important way of doing it. But you may need some help, which is why we call it guided, by an expert in reading HRV data so that you can really make the most of it. The third level really is the use of biomarkers, use of solid objective metrics. Not all of them are mainstream. In fact, many of them are emerging markers that should be used by the mainstream, but for one reason or not, they're not, often because they don't necessarily directly lead to producing more prescriptions of drugs. They invariably involve taking blood samples, urine samples, or stool samples, and sending those to labs. So they're often done with the support of a practitioner. And an example might be, instead of just looking at blood cholesterol and LDL and HDL, you might be looking at oxidized, very low density lipoprotein fractions and see if you actually have a problem that is more directly relating to your heart disease risk. You may also be looking at your endothelial function, the function of your arteries, and are your arteries a little bit more like copper pipes that don't have any flexibility, or do they respond when you start exercising as a result of nitric acid, which obviously puts you in a much healthier position. So there are many markers like that that have not found their way into the mainstream vocabulary. Another really important thing is understanding the degree of flexibility and resilience. You are part of an ecological system that is a dynamic system, and really important to not only be resilient and be able to bounce back, but also to flex within that system. So it's about being physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially, as well as metabolically flexible. Absolutely key. So let's have a quick look at what happens when we lose metabolic flexibility. Well, firstly, those of you who were around in the 1970s will remember that there weren't a lot of kids on low-carb diets or eating paleo, and yet there was very little in the way of weight problems amongst young school children or young adults. So what on earth happened? And of course, what did happen is that we moved into an addiction phase with carbohydrates, and that addiction phase was really triggered by this misunderstanding of the science around fat, and the development of low-fat products drove people to consume a lot more fats. And I strongly urge that you go onto the internet, have a look, put Marmot donut into YouTube and have a look at a video and see if that reminds you of yourself or anyone you might know when you are exposed to the possibility of consuming carbohydrate. Once we get over that addiction, a lot of good things happen from a health point of view. And of course, we only have to look at the Okinawans in Japan that lived to 100 years old and more, with very low rates of morbidity of chronic disease, to see that it shows us that carbohydrates themselves on their own are not all bad. It's what we do with them and how we prepare them and how they're processed that is the problem in relation to other nutrients that we consume. So the Okinawans have these phenomenally long lives, and yet 85% of their diet comes from carbohydrates. Most of it comes from purple sweet potatoes. So they're getting the polyphenols in from the sweet potatoes, but they're also traditionally have cooked the sweet potatoes in the morning, and then they cool before they eat them for most of the occasions during the day. They're also not consuming very much of it, so they are in effect in CR, caloric restriction mode as well, which we know also extends longevity. The bottom line is, when they consume these cooled down sweet potatoes, much of the carbohydrate turns into resistant starch. That means it can't be digested and it can't be readily converted into blood sugar. So the fiber within it actually provides a fantastic medium for the gut microbiome. And when we look at the chronic disease of those populations, it's really at odds even with the rest of Japan. And of course, the chronic disease rates are so low compared particularly with places like the United States of America. So the take home here is that our goal has to be not treating individual diseases, but working to find ways of achieving optimum function across multiple systems. And of course, we've defined these 12 systems in the domain. Within our blueprint are different ways of measuring your function across this. And of course, there are a host of practitioners out there that can act as health guides. And if we have a common language, and both the individual and the health guide is focused on trying to enhance function across one or more domains, we can actually move to a system where the body is functioning across multiple systems in a way that does not provide an internal environment that's conducive to the development of pathologies of disease. And of course, that means shifting away from a pill for your ill model to a system where you're doing multiple things, a bit like Dale Bredeson's protocol. And for many people, that's, to use a pun, a difficult pill to swallow, because we've been educated for years that we can just pop a pill and something happens. And of course, one of the reasons that many people are now motivated to take more care of themselves and to find better ways of self-caring is because they've realized that the pill for an ill model, for many of the diseases that provide the principal burdens in society, like cancer, heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, osteoarthritis, and all of the massive, over 100 different autoimmune conditions, don't respond well to any specific pill, any specific tablet. So that's something that we really need to change. And having a prioritization system that is informed by your performance across 12 domains can be extremely helpful. Now, to move towards triggering a regenerative health revolution, we need to focus on many things. Individuals have to become, the grassroots have to become the primary driver of change at a social level, because industry is pretty happy with the business as usual model. But of course, there are increasingly institutions and academic institutions specifically, as well as governments that are going, the system is going to break. So if we can combine bottom-up, people-powered movement together with a top-down academic and policy-driven movement, we can actually start to see change. And for us, one of the principal precursors is that we have awareness, that we understand that there is a system you can put around healthcare that uses all the elements of the existing system, but in different ways. That requires awareness. And that's really why we've called it a blueprint, because it is a blueprint not until it actually gets put into practice does it become a viable healthcare model. And critical to this next step is really demonstrating that it works. And that's the area we're very heavily involved in at the moment. We're raising funds, we're developing large-scale trials in different regions so that we can see how this works in communities, in different settings, in multiple settings. So it's really important that a system like this that is working in the real world doesn't rely on a classic clinical trial model where you're looking at randomized placebo-controlled trials with very limited interventions. You're looking at outcomes on a larger scale within the diverse workings of this dynamic ecosystem within which all of us live. As you measure this, it's really important to be looking at how does it all work from a sustainability perspective. If we look at the three key pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental, what are the metrics across those three systems? So built into the pilot trials that we're developing now are really ways of drawing strong information so that we can see where we are in terms of sustainability metrics. And finally, really important to be able to get the political and legislative support to be able to encompass a system like this that really is working with nature rather than against it, that is using the best available knowledge of really how humans function within this dynamic ecological system within which we live. So we need to get that political change, we need to get legislative support, and all of that is possible where there is sufficient demand. So we're all working hard on it. We'd love you all to get on board with it. We have a lot of information coming out continuously through our website and other channels about this project. and you can find more information on our website. So thank you very much. Mel, perhaps over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rob. I really hope you enjoyed that. And as Rob said, if you would like more information, it's all up on the screen now, and you can go to the website. I noticed I've got a few questions here, Rob, that have come through while we've been on the webinar. And one of the questions is, where can I find more information about the sustainable health work you're doing? And so I'd just like to say that if you look on the home page, there's a promo box on the front that's got the Blueprint campaign in it. And if you click on that, it will take you through to all the sustainability work. And you can read about the model there. So Rob, in terms of a few other questions, first one, could you explain how the ANH food plate fits with the idea of health regeneration?
Well, our food guide essentially is really a way of taking the existing evidence of what we know about diet generally, and coming together, effectively creating a parallel version compared with what we see with government guidelines. When you look at the available evidence, we can see that if people eat in accordance with the government guidelines, they actually are more likely to develop metabolic diseases. And to some degree, it's because the guidelines don't give sufficient information on really critical issues, such as processing, provenance, the sourcing of foods, preparation of foods before you eat them, and probably most of all, eating frequencies. We've got to remember, it's not just the quality and quantity of the food, it's when you eat. So if you look at our food for health plate, we are really focusing largely on the consumption of unprocessed or minimally processed foods. We're looking at ways of eating patterns that ensure that there is sufficient diversity of nutrients, whether these come from animal sources or plant sources. We've even developed a vegan version. We are convinced that it is possible to eat as a vegan sustainably and healthily, but it's much tougher. So to be a vegan, you need to be a careful vegan, that's for sure. You know, the bottom line is, within our food for health guide, we have 10 different pointers that also support ways of eating, some additional detail that just is not contained in government guidelines. And these are generalized. Very often there is a need to personalize further, particularly for people who have specific conditions or different genetic backgrounds. But as a general thrust, for most people, it is a useful starting point to eat in a really healthy manner.
Great, thank you. And for anyone who's not familiar with our work on this, if you go to our Food for Health campaign page on the website, also accessible from the front page, from the home page, you will see that not only do you get the downloadable PDF posters of the plates that you can put up in the kitchen, but you also, all of our related articles are underneath. So you can read about metabolic flexibility and how to eat to fuel your fat burning system rather than your carbohydrate burning system. And we can also do another webinar on that later down the track. I'm really aware of time, and I know we've run over, and thank you for those of you who've stuck with us. Rob, two other very quick questions before we finish. This one, I'm concerned about my immune system, and I know about vitamins and minerals. Is there anything else I can do coming into winter?
Yes, interesting that they know about vitamins and minerals, great. So obviously vitamin D is absolutely critical, and getting the dosages up of vitamin D to upwards of 4,000 international units a day, probably 8,000, 10,000 a day for a lot of people is required. Really important to look at the vitamin D status. It appears that different people have very different ways of actually, or they require very different dosing in order to optimize circulating levels of hydroxy vitamin D. And you may need a practitioner to establish what your vitamin D status is. In terms of other vitamins, everyone's very familiar with vitamin C and zinc, for example, but what's less known is some of the other factors that are really, there's a huge amount of research developing, for example, on nucleotides. And nucleotides are one of the most fundamental groups of what are often regarded as conditionally essential nutrients. Many people may not even have heard of them, but they probably was one of the original compounds that were hanging around in the primordial soup before life was created, because they are absolutely essential to the structure of DNA and RNA that we need for life. And of course, we need new DNA and RNA every time we produce cells. So one of the reasons that they're considered conditionally essential is because where we have a rapid rate of either the cellular damage or a need for cellular replacement, we need nucleotides. And we have different ways of sourcing our nucleotides internally. We can make some, so we've got de novo synthesis pathways, and we can also salvage some from cells that are breaking down in the body. But it turns out the third pathway for accessing more nucleotides is becoming increasingly important, and that's through consumption, exogenous nucleotides. We've always consumed some nucleotides. If we look at our evolution, most of them have come through consuming things like offal meats that have been almost removed from the food chain, and also fermented foods, which for some people now are coming back in. But for many people, they don't consume enough of these. So when we start looking at the immune system itself, the home of which really is in the gut, 75% of all immune reactions are occurring within the gut. We need to produce large numbers of immune cells. We need also a very healthy gut lining where we have cellular turnover of cells within our intestinal lumen that's 3 to 4 days. So if we take them exogenously as supplements or in foods, it can be fantastically helpful. And there's even research saying that nucleotides are so fundamental that they are instrumental in cellular repair processes, which means they're really good for anti-aging. Anti-aging isn't something that we just want to indulge in if we care about cosmetic appearances on the outside. Of course, anti-aging is about a mechanism whereby we can actually reduce chronic diseases because we're not aging so rapidly.
That's wonderful, and I know that we haven't got time to go into it now, but there's loads of botanicals as well. Can you just say one or two off the top of your head before I move on to the last question?
Yeah, obviously there's a tract of botanicals. Many of you are familiar with turmeric or olive leaf, and then you can get on to specific herbs like andrographis that have very specific functions, have very good science that demonstrates benefits, particularly in upper respiratory tract infections. And then we've got other botanicals like ashwagandha, for example, that's really important as an adaptogen. I talked about the immune system requiring modulation more than boosting, and herbs like ashwagandha are really, really important in terms of modulating the immune system.
That's great. So the very last question, and Rob, I know you can talk for another 2 hours on this subject, so could you make it very brief? But this question is, you said a bit about red meat at the beginning. Can you say more about the effect on health? Is it really dangerous? So talk about dropping an atom bomb right at the end of the webinar.
Yes, you know, looking at the science on red meat, it is really confounded with industrially farmed animals and the changes in the meat. If we look at the quality of red meats that are coming out of industrial farming systems compared with low intensity grass-fed systems, the meat is entirely different. The fatty acid profiles are different. The levels of stress hormones are different. The quality of the protein is different. There are many aspects of which are very different. And obviously, when you look at the sustainability impact, they are massively different. And of course, one of the reasons that people are being told for environmental reasons to pull red meat out of the system is because they're using data that has actually come from industrial farming systems, not on pasture-fed grassland systems. From a health perspective, when you look at indigenous cultures and cultures that have lived off significant amounts of red meats that are not produced through industrial farming, the epidemiological evidence is very, very different. And there is no real suggestion that red meat itself is harmful. How we produce the meat seems to bring in a whole lot of additional risk factors, and then how we prepare the meat brings in some additional risk factors. So if we decide to cremate all of the red meat and burn it and produce, say, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, through the use of high temperatures that causes the blackening of the meat, which is pretty popular with a lot of people, we see a definite trend for it, which is why there's very clear evidence that barbecuing of meats contributes to increased risk of cancer. But if we're able to consume grass-fed meats and treat the meats with respect, as well as the animals with respect, I don't believe there are significant risks at all. And in fact, there are many added benefits.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thank you all for joining us. And for those of you who stuck with it till the end, I hope it's been really useful, and really look forward to being with you again on another webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.